Well, good evening, everybody. So we're back again looking at the NHX-10K inverter. And tonight I wanted to try and quickly go through some of the different configuration options that I've seen that probably a lot of folks would want to know how to do. So some of those might be setting up battery communications, setting up zero export, looking at self-consumption mode, and another big one would probably be, well, how do you tell it when to switch back to the grid? So I want to look at all that stuff tonight and anything else that happens to pop into my mind as I'm going through some of this configuration. So let's get started. So when you're in lead acid mode on the inverter, it's not super accurate. And if we go into the settings and look at the battery in lead acid mode, and over on this next page, you've got all your different settings for your lead acid configuration. So your float charge, your absorption voltage, your cutoff, your capacity. And so you would make all these changes here and then hit save. The inverter, I believe, uses the PylonTech protocol. And so any battery that supports the PylonTech protocol should be able to communicate with this inverter, no problem. And so I have the Orient Power 230 amp hour servo rack battery, and that is by default configured with the PylonTech protocol. And I have it already plugged into the CAN communication port. And that cable comes up through this gland right here, and I'm going to plug it into this bottom left port. In the settings area, all we have to do is switch over to lithium and hit save. The inverter is going to reset, and then it's going to search for that communication protocol, and you can see it's already cleared the alarm that did show up initially. Now it's showing 51% out of the battery, and then our battery type is set to lithium. If we look in the settings again, under battery, we've got our charge current set to 100 amps. This is something that's important to set because by default, I want to say 25 is what comes to mind. And I didn't realize that my PV was being limited because my charge current was set so low. So you want to make sure to increase that charge current, and we already had it set to the CAN protocol. And so it just works. There's really no configuration other than picking the protocol and then saying you want lithium to get the initial battery communication set up. And then you can set your battery grid depth of discharge and your off-grid depth of discharge for your lithium configuration. So you've got your lead acid information in this top section and your lithium specific settings in this lower section. Make your appropriate changes and then hit save. So the next thing is probably looking at, people want to be able to set this up in a zero export configuration so that it does not send any power back out to the grid. And so there's a few steps that need to be taken in order to set that up. The first thing you'll need to do is plug in your CT cables into these two ports, the lower row, the right two ports in the bottom of your inverter. And then these cables are going to correspond to leg 1, and then the one on the left is going to be leg 2. And if you want a zero export, you should plug those CT cables, the little current transformers. Ideally, you would plug them right into here, right at the base of where your AC in comes into the inverter. So that way it will detect everything that comes through this cable and not allow any power to go past this point. I'm constantly moving my CTs around, and so I just plugged them down here, but they are on my AC in lines, so it should detect power on these lines and not allow any power to go past those CTs. Now, a couple important things to note is you have to have these CT cables connected. That is how power is shown on the display. If the CTs are not connected, you will not see current flowing on this display from the grid dashboard. The other thing is you need to make sure that they are connected to the right leg in your inverter. This thing can start really acting wonky And that's the best technical term that I can give you, wonky, if they are not plugged in to the right spot. But just remember that if you're seeing odd results coming from the grid connection, try switching these cables around. I had thought that I had these wired correctly, and I actually called Ian, and I was very frustrated that I couldn't figure it out. And Ian said, just try switching the cables. And I'm like, I know they're wired correctly. He's like, just try it. And I tried it, and I had to eat humble pie because as soon as I switched these cables around, everything started reflecting properly. Once you've got the CTs connected, you'll come into the settings again, hit the gear icon, default password, and you're going to want to select zero export mode. By default, it's going to be set to disabled over here. And you need to understand that whatever you select on the right-hand side here is going to override these three settings over here. So we want to select zero export and then uncheck cell enable because you don't want power to go back out to the grid. You want to limit that as much as possible. And I even came over here and set grid export limit to 0 just to make sure that nothing was going to go past those clamps. And then you hit save, and now your system should be in a zero export mode where you're not pushing any power back out past those CT clamps. Now, if you wanted to do a self-consumption mode, which would allow a backfeed from the AC input to go to your grid panel and supply loads to your grid panel as well, you're going to do a lot of what we just did, except you need to relocate the CT clamps. So over my left shoulder is my grid connected panel. That's where my AC input comes from this panel to supply grid to this inverter. We want to move the CT clamps that were down in this wireway over to the top main grid lines that feed from the meter to this panel. And again, you need to make sure that you have the CTs in the proper order. The proper CT, leg 1 has to be on leg 1, leg 2 has to be on leg 2. But something else to pay attention to is on these CTs, there's an arrow. The arrow on these CTs always has to point towards the meter. So we've got our CTs connected, arrow pointing up on that one, arrow pointing up on that one. Be very, very cautious when you're working in this panel. Even when you turn this main breaker off, those two studs are still hot. So for self-consumption mode, go to the gear, enter your password. Advanced mode needs to be disabled, and then work mode on self-consumption. Cell enable is unchecked because we don't want to sell anything back. And so right now the battery is supplying power to the loads in that grid panel. And so I'm going to go and actually turn the dryer on, and we're going to see that power flowing and being supplied. And then I have a monitoring tool on my grid panel showing power coming from the grid. And we'll see if that reflects the dryer running from grid power or this thing. So Ian's going to turn the dryer on. And we can see in this app, the load is just dropping significantly. So it started, it surged, and now we're showing 6 kilowatts coming out of the battery. But this power still is not showing correct. So I wonder if my connections are backwards. So I'm going to switch these under here. And now we're seeing proper power. Nope, I had it right to begin with. This is what it shows like when it's backwards. So let's fix that now, because now you can see it looks like it's pulling 11 kilowatts from the grid and putting 5 into the battery. It's wrong. So switching the cables, now it shows we're pushing 5.6 to that grid side. We see in the Sense app, the power level drops significantly, and here we've got 6,000 watts coming out of the battery, all from self-consumption mode. I'm not sure why this is not reflecting properly though. Oh, I know why. Duh. Because this is only sensing what's coming from the meter. That's right. Should have known that. The CTs over here are only sensing what's coming through, not what's going past. And you're not going to see the consumption in this panel off of the CTs because the CTs are up before the panel. Duh. But we're pulling 5,000, 6,000 watts out of this system for the dryer. So that's self-consumption mode in a nutshell. Making a few changes. The biggest thing is the CT cables. Make sure they're wired correctly, facing the right direction. That's going to be probably 90% of your problems if you experience them when you're trying to set up this self-consumption mode, because I had those problems too. So let's see, what other stuff did I want to show you? That's right. How do you set the system to determine when you're going to switch back to grid? And to configure that, you're going to look at time of use settings. And I've been told it's fairly similar to how the Solarcs work. I've never used a Solarc. I've never seen a Solarc other than in videos, so sure. So to configure time of use settings, we're going to go into the settings again, and we're going to look under Advanced. And this is going to be our time of use table. And so the way this table works is, by default, time of use is disabled. You need to enable it, and then you can set 6 different time slots. And these time slots allow you to control how much power you want to come out of the battery, and then what do you want to supply, grid or generator, the excess, and then down to what state of charge do you want to utilize battery power. So I have mine set to all. I'm not using the times right now. Battery power, 8,000 watts by default. Stated charge, 25% is what I set mine to. But we're gonna test this right now, because I can hear that the dehumidifier is running. And so we can see we're pulling 66 watts for the dehumidifier. So I'm going to actually add a larger load so that we can actually see this time of use work. I would use the bounce house blower, but it's late at night and I don't want that loud of a noise running. So I added the vacuum cleaner. As this load, we can see 1.5 kilowatts coming out. Our battery's currently at 49%. Now, if we go into our time of use settings, Advanced, right now it is 2141, so it's within this last range. So if I set this to 50%, currently the battery's at 49, and we come, always got to remember to save it. See, it didn't save it. If I set this to 50%, save it, and then go back to the home page, we can see the load is now being pulled from the grid and not the battery. Now, the other thing about the time of use settings is this battery power column. That's a determination of how much battery power do you want to pull from the battery and let these other things supply power when the battery power is not sufficient. So I'm going to come back and set this back to 25% so that it does switch back over to battery. And remember, our load is 1400 watts right now. I want to change this battery power to 500 watts. I only want 500 watts to come out of the battery and the rest to come from the grid. If I hit OK and save, now we come back to the dashboard and we see power coming out of the battery and 1,000 watts coming from the grid. There we go. 400, 500 watts coming out of the battery, 900 watts coming from the grid. So that feature allows you to split your loads between your battery and grid or generator, which is pretty sweet if you think about it, because if you want to maintain your batteries at a certain level, you can still utilize a little bit of that battery power and have it use excess from the grid. So it took me a while to get my head wrapped around how to make it all work from that time of use standpoint. But now that I understand that I can control how much power comes out of the battery while letting something else supply the remaining power, and then I can pick my state of charge. So you could really dial this in for different times of the day. So if you want to utilize more grid power during off-peak times, I mean, there's peak shift settings in this inverter as well, which I'm not going to get into, but you can utilize these options for a peak shift and tell it to use more grid power at certain times and use more battery power at other times when power's more expensive. A lot of control. I think the word that was told to me was it's a little more complex, because I was coming from, you know, the EG4 aspect where you just set your state of charge value that you want it to switch back to the grid, and then it switches at that value. Well, with this, there's even more control. So lastly, a couple extra things that I wanted to show you. It just might be a couple niceties just to know how to do it. One is going to be how to turn off grid charging, because if you're like me, you don't want to charge from the grid. You want to utilize solar power to charge your batteries, let it fall over to the grid if you don't have enough battery power, but only recharge from solar. So if you wanted to turn off grid charge, you go into your gear, into your settings, and then you're going to hit the advanced settings and then over. And on this page, you're going to uncheck grid charge enable. And so that will prevent grid charging from happening. I believe with the time of use, when it gets below to where it switches back to the grid, that battery value that we saw, battery power. So when this state of charge switches back to the grid, so if it's at 24% and it switches back to grid, I believe this battery power column is the amount of power that can go into the battery when you're in a grid mode. And so if you uncheck grid enable, it will not try and pull that power from the grid. I believe PV charge only will disable charging from the generator as well. I would think by default charging can happen from the generator, which you would want it to if it's a generator. These two options, you can only have one of them checked. So either you're going to have grid charge enabled or PV charge only. And so having that unchecked will stop this from feeding power from the grid into your batteries. And the other thing that we saw in the last video is this screen has the ability to dim. And depending on where you install this inverter, you might want it to dim, you might want it to turn all the way off after a few minutes of not using it. So I'll show you where that setting is as well, because it took me a while to figure out it's in my basement. I don't need the lights, I don't need the backlight to stay on. When I'm not around, the screen can turn off. If I was having it outside, I'd want the screen to turn off. So we go to the gear setting, and we go to the little paper icon on the top right, and we go over right here, backlight enable. The backlight time, that's self-explanatory. After how much time of inactivity do you want it to basically dim the backlight? And so if backlight is enabled, then these settings become active. If you turn off backlight enable, that means that the screen's going to be on all the time. So the backlight brightness, if you set this to 0%, after 180 seconds, the screen turns off. And that's what I wanted in my house, because I don't need the glow, I don't need it wasting the power to be able to see what's going on. And again, if you're outside, you might want this turned off as well. If you set it to 15 or 20%, that's when it's going to dim, like what we saw in the last video. So 100% means no dimming, and then every value underneath that, all the way down to 0, is going to dim the screen after whatever your backlight time is. So you'll make that change, and then again, hit the little save icon. So I hope going through some of these little different configuration options helps. Coming into this from different styles of inverters, some of it was kind of confusing to me in trying to figure out how to make things work. And so once I figured out how to make those things work, now it all makes sense to me. But that's fine, because every inverter, every configuration is different. They all do things differently, and you just have to figure out how they work. So I wanted to share those different ways to configure this system. It looks complex. And when I heard the word complex earlier, when I was asking how to do something, my initial thought was, okay, complex means hard. But it doesn't. It just means that it's more flexible to be able to do a lot of different things that you don't really think about. And that's kind of neat to me. I mean, giving you that flexibility, that ability to do different things that you wouldn't normally think about, it's like, wow, this thing can really do all that. I could see using some of those time of use settings, like if I know I've got a storm coming in or something, let's let it offset a little bit of power from the battery, but keep that big buffer. So if the power does go out, but I'm still not drawing 100% from the grid, which is sweet. I'm still able to help supplement some of my loads by pulling power from the battery. I know I said short video at the beginning. You guys should know by now, I don't know what the meaning of short is when it comes to length of a video. And again, I want to thank you guys. It's kind of humbling to see that 10,000 subscriber mark. Not something that I really expected to see, but that's all from you guys, so thank you very much for that. So with that, I'm gonna let y'all go. Y'all stay safe, stay cool, and we'll catch up with you later.